It was May of 1932.
It's a spectacle unparalleled in the history of the country.
And something was very wrong in the land of plenty.
A day of bloodshed and riot.
There were those of us who felt that America was teetering on the brink of revolution.
For 3 years, the Great Depression had tormented Americans. Now, 20,000 Army veterans and their families came pouring into Washington to find out what the government was going to do about it.
They were bearded, they were ragged, they were desperate. You could see it in their eyes.
They'd been promised a bonus for their service in World War I, but it was not due to be paid until 1945. The desperate veterans wanted their money now. They were called the Bonus Army. On July 28th, the Bonus Army came to blows with Washington police. Shots were fired. President Herbert Hoover barricaded himself in the White House and called out the troops.
The soldiers have orders to burn down the unsanitary and illegal camps. And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic Bonus Army.
When the smoke cleared, 2 veterans and an infant were dead.
It was absolutely shameful. The sacrifice of the young American boys left such an impression on me, I have never forgotten it. They were just trying to feed their families.
Millions of Americans could no longer provide for their families. With nowhere to turn for help, they were angry and they were approaching their breaking point. 3 years into the Depression, the American system was in grave danger. Unless it could change and change quickly, it might not survive.
Bad times had arrived without warning. After a decade of expanding prosperity, almost overnight, the Wall Street crash of 1929 shattered America's confidence in its economy.
For the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about hard times and a New Deal. The focus question is what factors led to the Great Depression and how did Herbert Hoover and FDR respond? So we're primarily going to focus on what were the causes of the Great Depression and how did our president at the time, Herbert Hoover, respond to those to the Great Depression. First, let's go back and briefly talk about the Gilded Age. Remember, during the Gilded Age from 1870 until about 1900, our government took a very laissez-faire approach, a hands-off approach, and really let big business do whatever they wanted. Because of that, big business will grow, trusts will develop, monopolies will form, and the government takes a laissez-faire approach, and the workers will really struggle and have a difficult life during that time. That will directly lead to the Progressive Era. So the presidents listed on top, TR, Taft, and Wilson, those presidents are known as our progressive presidents. Government got bigger, they took a very hands-on approach, and there were a lot of reforms during that time. It's also important to note that we had World War I occur during the Progressive Era. So once we get past World War I into the 1920s, the American public was looking for change. Small government, less intrusive government, getting out of the war, and that's going to lead to the Republican Party being elected into office at this time. So Warren G. Harding, the president listed in the bottom left, his platform is return to normalcy. Part of that is small government, less intrusion, kind of going back to how things were during the Gilded Age. The presidents here are going to take a laissez-faire approach as well as the entire government, and that's going to be really important to understand in the 1920s. Now we're going to focus on some of the causes of the Great Depression. The first one, easy credit. Simply put, banks loaned a lot of money out during the 1920s. This is a very consumer-driven economy. Americans wanted to buy a lot of consumer items, cars, radios, and other consumer products. Americans are going to buy these items oftentimes on installment plans. We know that we are a very consumer-based economy today. We definitely see that in the 1920s. Americans wanted to buy these products, homes and cars, and banks were more than willing to loan out the money. Simply put, banks were loaning out too much money at this time. They were reckless in their loaning of money, and there really wasn't any government regulation. Remember, the government was taking a hands-off approach, and that easy credit will lead to a lot of issues later when Americans can't pay back the banks. We simply have too much debt during the 1920s because of that easy credit. Another cause of the Great Depression was buying on margin. Millions of Americans were buying on margin at this time, which basically means they were borrowing a lot of money from a financial investment firm or a bank to purchase stock. It's very risky when you purchase stock on margin. If the stock goes up, which oftentimes happened in the early to mid-20s, you would stand to make a lot of money. But if the stock would go down, you lost all that value in the stock, plus you still have to repay the banks the money that you borrowed, which is going to cause a lot of Americans to not be able to pay those banks back. And then, of course, once the banks don't get paid back, that's just going to escalate this problem. So the stock market and essentially no regulation of the stock market was another major cause of the Great Depression. The economy was starting to show signs of stress in the late 1920s. Really, the beginning of the Great Depression will occur, though, when the stock market completely collapses and crashes in October of 1929. It's at this time that once stocks plummet, remember, a lot of these companies, that they weren't regulated at all, and oftentimes they were turning in phony numbers, and people continued to purchase those stocks. The stock market will come crashing down, and the value of some companies just completely collapsed, and it left a lot of Americans with a whole bunch of just worthless stock. So a lot of Americans are going to again lose all of their life savings. They're still going to owe banks money, and then it's really going to spiral from the stock market crash. From the stock market crash, we're going to quickly see how that will impact the banks. So with so many people losing money in the stock market, it would make sense for those people to go to their banks to take out what other money they had. This is going to be known as a bank run. Once a lot of people just are in that panic state over the economy, many people will flock to their banks. And banks don't keep typically, that kind of money on hand. Remember, they're investing money, they're loaning money out. They're at this time investing money in the stock market. So when people go to invest their money, the banks, or to take their money out, the banks just don't have the money. Many banks will go bankrupt. They won't have the money to give back to the people who trusted their banks and really sometimes had their whole life savings in the bank. Those people will be devastated and distraught. We see a lot of suicides in the late 1920s over this economic catastrophe. Understand that this will, of course, lead to a lack of confidence in banks moving forward. The government will really have to intervene here to get people to just have more confidence in the banking system. Again, make sure that you understand, if banks don't have money, they can't loan any other money out for new businesses or to keep businesses afloat. And that's just going to continue this catastrophe. When banks don't have money, that's going to lead to our economy just becoming stagnant. And that's usually when depressions get completely out of hand and devastating for the people. And this is where we see things get really bad for the people. If you owned a whole bunch of stock, you would have lost everything. And now that banks are starting to collapse, if you would have had money in your bank, you also lost all of that money within your bank. So Americans are panicking. We're looking at unemployment around 25% by 1933. This is a vicious cycle. People don't have money, they can't buy their consumer products, and now those people who own those businesses and work in those factories, now they lost their job as well. And we have a lot of Americans at this time who are really blaming themselves. We see a lot of suicides, we see a lot of incidents like that, and this will continue to plague our country really for most of the 1930s. What made matters worse for our country was our government was very slow to respond. The late 1920s going into the early 1930s, Herbert Hoover, the Republican president, believed in taking that hands-off approach within the economy, and to his fairness, the government wasn't used to really responding to major events like this in the past. Despite the Progressive Era, when we saw the government getting bigger, any type of national depression, panic that we've seen in the past, it really wasn't the government's job to intervene within the economy. So Herbert Hoover and many others believed that this would pass. They just need to kind of, wait it out. So the government took a hands-off approach. The government encouraged people to volunteer, help each other out when you can. We also adopted something called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. Now remember, when we pass a tariff, we're limiting foreign goods coming into our country. We're making those goods more expensive. So foreign products, foreign companies, they're not going to be able to sell as many products here because those are going to be more expensive. When we put on tariffs to other countries will typically respond and put on tariffs on our goods. So the Hawley-Smoot Tariff really didn't have the impact that they were looking for, promoting Americans to buy more American products. It really continued to stifle the economy even more. And then we have the RFC was going to be adopted late in his administration. It's going to provide some credit to banks and businesses, but not nearly enough and really not soon enough. This will lead to all this stress put on our country at this time will lead to something known as the Bonus Army Fiasco. With this, we have World War I veterans who are marching to Washington, D.C. All they're doing is they're looking for their Army bonus a little bit early. They were supposed to get this about a decade later for serving in World War I. They're marching, they want their bonuses, they need the money, as many Americans do, and our government will essentially turn them away. Again, the Depression is getting worse and worse as we get into the early 1930s. With the 25% unemployment rate, Americans suffering everywhere we go, one of our most difficult times in the course of our history. Many Americans lost their home during the Great Depression. They're going to be forced to live in these rundown houses called Hoovervilles. These, again, this collection of dilapidated houses where people were forced to live. This is a visual that really shows just how challenging it was for many Americans during the Great Depression. Now we'll continue with more video footage from the Great Depression and more stories from people who lived through that very difficult time.
I was 11 years old. But how well I remember it. It was like the skies had grown dark. Thunder. And all of a sudden, faces were tragic. And people were walking around in the hallways of our building and in the streets with inquiring eyes and saying, has it happened to you? Has it happened to us? What is happening?
The living telegrams at that time. And pretty soon, you could feel a horror. Behind the door you was knocking. When you knock on the door, when the voice come out, yeah, who is it, who is it? I say, I have a telegram. Well, slide it under the door, slide on, or go away. Get away from me, get away from me.
The collapse of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929 was only the most visible sign of a massive economic crisis. A crisis that spread quickly from Wall Street to Main Street. Miriam Johnson was living in California when the Great Depression arrived at her house.
I was 11 when the crash came. My father at that time, along with a few friends, owned a small grocery store. One day he came home and he laid $2 on the table in the kitchen. And he said, "No more store. Everything is gone." And that was the end. For us, it was the end.
Every day produced more bankruptcies, more layoffs, more people with less money in their pockets. Even U.S. Steel, a symbol of American industrial might since the turn of the century, was brought to its knees. In 3 years, the entire full-time payroll was laid off. 225,000 workers.
The Depression hit this country all over. It hit the farm areas, it hit the cities. You were just there, out of work and out of food. And everybody was baffled. You know, nobody had ever had that experience before.
I had been saving for maybe 5-6 years a piggy bank, money in a piggy bank. Nickels, pennies, dimes the most. It turns out that I was the only one in the family that had any money. Because one day I came home and I grabbed hold of my piggy bank just to give it a shake, and there was nothing in it. My mother was looking at me and she said, "Your father borrowed the money. He has to go out to look for work and he needed money to go downtown." And he came home and I didn't say anything, but my face was swollen with tears. My eyes were blinking with tears. And my father took me in his arms and he said, "I'm sorry. I had to have the money. But it's a loan. I'll pay it back to you." He never did. He never did.
My family had exhausted all its credits with the local merchants. And on one occasion, my father came home and asked what was for dinner that night, and my mother said, "There's nothing." How could that be? How could there be nothing? It was one of the few times in my life that I was fearful for myself.
Fearful of losing what little they had left, people rushed to the banks to withdraw their savings. But the banks, too, were short of cash. 1 year after the crash, 800 of them had failed. 9 million savings accounts were wiped out.
There was a janitor called George Gallies who had $1,000 in the Bank of the United States. It had taken Gallies 40 years to save $1,000. After spending 2 nights and 2 days in the pouring rain outside this shuttered, locked bank, literally beating on the walls with his hands in frustration, he realized he was never going to see 10 cents of his money. And he went back to the basement where he lived, and he hanged himself in despair. That's what bank failures did. They crushed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of ordinary people like George Gallies.
With their savings gone and layoffs increasing, people were forced to sell their cars, their furniture, their wedding rings. Before long, half the country's home mortgages were in default. Families across America found themselves facing eviction.
I remember my brother and I and my mother just couldn't stand to see it happen. So we left my father there to face the auctioneers. When we came home that evening and we met my father, who told us, yes, the house was sold. It was gone. And everything that we had had was no longer ours. The land was gone, the house was gone, and we had 30 days in which time to move out. And my mother sat on the side of the bed and cried. It was the first time I'd ever seen her cry. I'll never forget that moment. That's how our family was affected, and we were not unique.
You know what hurt me most about it was the look of pain on my mother's and father's faces. I couldn't bear to look at them, to look at their misery, to look at their disgrace.
They felt they had only themselves to blame. This was a different generation. This was a generation that had grown up with the old faith, the faith in self-reliance, that people had to stand on their own 2 feet. They didn't say the government has failed me. They said, I'm to blame. I failed in this American system of ours. It's my fault.
One year after the crash, 4 million American families were without any means of support. Worse, they didn't know how to ask for help, and their government didn't know how to provide it.
In 1930, the American people had almost no sense of the national government. There was the post office. Occasionally you'd see a soldier on the street. The national government had very little direct impact on the lives of ordinary Americans. There were no parachutes in those days. There was no Social Security, no unemployment insurance, no nothing. You just were on your own.